Hello, good day. Today I'm here with Lisa Logan for our KMK video blog. Lisa recently joined a KMK consultant and is an assistant principal for our market research team. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Excited for
Sure.
our conversation.
Yeah, so Lisa just recently joined KMK, and she brings a wealth of oncology market research experience. And so today I wanted to chat with her a little bit about her experiences and knowledge of market research and understand a little bit about what's unique in this space. So Lisa, yeah, I know that market research can typically have a pattern, if you will, but I think because of the complexities of oncology, it can be a little bit different. I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I started off my career just in healthcare in general. So had exposure to, diabetes research and asthma, and those are complicated areas because of the heritage that a lot of products have in the space and, what it takes to introduce a new mechanism of action and things like that. But what's really interesting about oncology is that it just gets so much deeper, and there's so much more that you need to know about a therapy area, about a specific tumor type. And a lot of times what you know in one tumor type will not transfer to another tumor type. So even though it might seem like, if you know breast cancer, maybe you'll know AML, it's not true at all. There's a completely different way of looking at it, completely different lingo, completely different way of treating and mechanism of action that you need to use for different products. So that was kind of the first thing that stuck out to me when I started in oncology so many years ago. Now that I've been in it for 10 years, it is really interesting to see how quickly the science changes and how on top of it, you have to be on top of the news and, attending the conferences, stay up on what's kind of happening. Because these new technologies and new pathways enter, maybe immuno-oncology is probably the best place to start, where even 5 years ago, we weren't hearing anything about it. And now, Keytruda, Opdivo, Tecentriq are just dominating,
Right.
solid tumors and CAR therapies in the liquid tumor space. So it's an interesting area, a lot that you need to kind of learn about and stay on top of, really complicated.
Yeah, and that leads me to the question. So I think about people that are on the other side, like, for example, doctors, right? And the space is changing quickly for them as well. And so it seems to me that that's a real prevalent need for understanding market research, because we need to understand how the perception of people that are also being exposed to all of these rapid changes are reacting, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And there's a lot of different people a lot of different actors, right, that are participating in a decision-making process that a pharmaceutical company cares about. So the process is a little unique in terms of your approach to performing a study or an overall perspective, I would think. What's that like compared to, just
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because a lot of times, patients they're involved, but, a lot of times, especially in first diagnosis, they don't have the level of information or understanding that they would need to make a treatment decision. So they are really heavily reliant on their physicians. A lot of times payers weigh heavily in because these are really expensive treatments. And so you need to know what's going to be, how things are going to be covered. And there's a lot of kind of cost efficacy trade-offs that are happening on a much higher level than, the typical market research respondent that we would speak to. And then, nurses are crucial in a lot of these different therapy areas because, some of the treatments that require infusions and have really severe side effects that nurses need to manage, they can weigh pretty heavily into treatment decisions as well. If there's something that they feel uncomfortable with, or if they've seen, a lot of patients struggling with a specific side effect, their voice can carry a lot of weight with an oncologist or a hemonc for prescribing treatments as well. So it's kind of, we also speak to pharmacists, and, caregivers can have a really huge role here. especially in the metastatic setting, or for patients who have, relapsed or gone down a long road of treatment. So yes, you're exactly right. There's a lot more stakeholders involved here, and a number of different people that kind of can weigh in, depending on, the severity of the disease or where a patient is, their level of
Right.
knowledge or the education that they've, given themselves, and how willing they are to kind of fight back with their doctor about treatments and things like that. So there's a lot to unpick and unpack.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's less about, well, the doctor prescribes something and it either works or doesn't, so they're going to pick the best thing that works. It's more, there's a side effect that could be significant enough that will guide a doctor's decision to another direction, and that plays very heavily, I would think, into
Exactly.
the importance of how a drug is going to be aligned. So that's very interesting.
Yeah. And in the metastatic setting, it's doctors might feel like they're gambling. They might not know what's going to work well for a patient. And I can't imagine having that, hanging over your head and not being sure if the treatment that you chose is going to be the right one. And so I do think that they are, they feel an insecurity. There's a whole emotional aspect that goes along with it as well, which is really interesting to
Right,
how
right.
that.
And that the market's very competitive as well, too.
Mm.
So there's that's going to, I think, play into the branding, the positioning, the how do you differentiate.
Mm.
And I would think that market research within the space really aligns a lot of those components much better than the hard data, if you will, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because maybe lung cancer is a really good example to look at right now because there's a lot of targeted therapies. So if you just look at ALK, for example, patients who exhibit that mutation, I think there's like 5 or 6 different ALK inhibitors that you could choose to treat that. But it's a very small, 5% or less of patients who exhibit that mutation. So you're kind of going after a small market with all of these different competitors. Luckily those can be sequenced and, depending on a doctor's comfort level or all these other factors that kind of go into play. But that's a competitive space right there. And then on the other side, you have all these IO treatments that have really shown great efficacy in the lung cancer and non-small cell lung cancer space. But you're not able to sequence those. So it is a real heavy competition there with, Keytruda, Opdivo, Tecentriq, all the others that are kind of out. And yeah, you need to really unpick how are you going to get past the, the Keytruda kind of Goliath at this moment if you're in the lung cancer space. You only have one shot really to get that doctor on board with it, or to get that patient on the
Right.
IO therapy. So yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand where the opportunities are and how you
Sure.
can win.
Sure. Sure. Interesting. So, and as we've seen the whole space continue to evolve, it seems to continue to get more and more personalized. With some of the gene therapy that comes out and some of the really specific drugs that are pretty much manufactured to suit the need, right? How does that affect the future of the market research? It's just in your eyes, and it's an open question, but I don't think it's a right answer, but it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Where's this going, right?
It's so funny because when I first started my career, personalized meant targeting a tumor mutation. So like I was just
Right.
saying now, and that was personalized medicine. But now you think of personalized with it, thinking about like an immune system or a genetic code. And the drugs are not personalized per se, because it's one drug that's doing all these things. The response is personalized to that individual, which is a really different way of kind of thinking about personalized treatment from when I first started in oncology. So it's such a funny kind of switch that we've seen. And just going back to your previous point, like these are really complicated things that drugs are doing these days. And, I just attended a webinar last week where they were talking about, using CRISPR technology and changing genetic code and things like that. And I can imagine, for some oncologists, it's hard to like wrap your head around and stay on top of what the newest, it's technology at this point. It's almost gone
Yeah.
beyond medicine. It's like using, real like lab science to make these medications and to figure out how they work. So yeah, it's a really interesting idea of where personalized has kind of moved to. Being
I
a
know,
bit
and
visual. Yeah.
and all the knowledge that you gain with all these studies, you're going to be able to open your own practice in next year, a week or two, right?
Oh man, I know. My mom would be so excited.
Anyways, well, this was just a preview of some of the areas that we're seeing as a trend in the market research in the oncology space. Lisa, I want to thank you for your insights here. If anybody is interested in learning more, please reach out to KMK Consulting. We'd be happy to talk. Lisa, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much. This was fun. Appreciate it, Rob.
All right, and have a good day.
Okay.
All right. And to record. We are recording. Hello and welcome to today's KMK video blog. I'm here today with Lisa Logan, Assistant Principal for our Market Research team. Thank you, Lisa, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So Lisa, today I wanted to have a short discussion around design thinking. Design thinking is a topic that has been coming up a lot recently, and very interested to get your perspective on what it is, how folks are potentially using this. So let me just start with a pretty open, broad question. What is design thinking and how does that compare and differ to the more traditional market research that we see, such as an ATU study and so forth?
Yeah, it's such an interesting idea and practice that it is actually really hard to define it because it can be so many things.
Right.
The most at its most basic, it's kind of a combination of psychology, of looking at mental models, of it even incorporates behavioral sciences and kind of trying to figure out why people do the things that they do and how to act upon some of the feedback that you might be getting from actual users. So when it relates to market research, though, it becomes kind of a different idea because you can use it in so many different ways. So one thing that's really interesting about design thinking is that there is an agility behind it and a constant iteration of your approach, of the way that you're doing things. You can keep kind of going ahead and then looking at what you have, stepping back, and then going ahead again to really make sure that by the end, you have this product that's really going to work and is going to work for all of your users. So, I mean, the foundations of it are in design and IT, and the idea behind it is, you're not putting out a final product right away. You're putting out kind of the beta version, and then you're testing it and seeing how it's going, and then you're revising it and kind of moving on from there. So going back to what I was, the application to market research, it can be a really interesting way of thinking about market research, because in one way you can utilize some of these principles of agility and of kind of iteration and making sure that what you're getting to, the final point that you're at, is like an actual final point. But you can also use a number of different features of it in a market research sense and use different approaches. So some of the things that we do, we're particularly interested in mental models and trying to understand, the bigger picture of what's going on in our kind of customer and our respondent minds. So we use a number of different approaches in our screening criteria and, a series of questions in our questionnaires or in our discussions to really understand how are people processing information? Like, what's the way that their head works when they're trying to figure things out? Are they short to the point? Do they start at the very beginning, when they're trying to tell you a process of something? Do they do all the details? Are they very high level? All of that can give you a sense of who this person is and how they're going to take in the information that we're sharing with them, and gives you a whole nother layer that you can look at when you're kind of analyzing their information or their data. So, it really can go beyond just what they're saying in the interview to try and figure out what's really behind some of the statements that we hear.
Yeah, very much more immersive. It sounds like
Mhm.
you're really getting into the head and the mind. So I would imagine that the construction of it's not even a study, right? It's almost like a roadmap and a plan.
Yeah, and it's not a particular study. It's kind of an overlay to any
Right.
research that we do, any projects that we do. Um, I think clients these days, our clients, they want to understand what the findings are, but they also want to understand what the true insight is. What does this
Mhm.
really mean for their business challenge they're facing? What does this mean for the longer term strategy of their brand? And using some of these approaches through design thinking, looking at the bigger mental models, trying to understand where different things fit in, can give you a completely different layer and level of insight, and really put the market research findings into the fuller context, um, which I think offers so much more value than just a straightforward question and like doing the AT. Right?
I'm smiling because I'm thinking, okay, so you do a market research study and you say, okay, well, that's interesting versus something that you can actually act upon.
Exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. And that's the real benefit is, the insights are there. And then, utilizing some of the cues that we're hearing, or using prospection to look in future markets, or what this is really going to mean, at the time when your product launches, can really give you some tactical, actionable, outputs. What do I do with this information? It's not just X number are aware of your brand. It's, what more can we do? How can we get more people interested? What's
Right.
our, what's the hook? Why the people who are paying attention, why are they paying attention? Answering all of those questions on top of
Right.
just the percentage.
Right. Interesting. So I'll be honest, it's a relatively new topic for me. So I did a little research before preparing for this, right? And it definitely is real. For example, there's a course at MIT, a 12-week course that you can take in design thinking. There's a recent HBR article that compared design thinking to the revolution of quality management in the 1980s. So there's some legs behind this. I'm interested in how this is relevant to some of the trends that we see in the pharmaceutical industry today, and
Mm.
how that can be applied.
Yeah, great question. I mean, some of the trends, I do a lot of oncology research, especially in oncology. I mean, there's some really difficult business questions
Right.
that people have. Sometimes it's easy to get into a space. There might not be a lot of other treatments. And sometimes you're product number 6, that's doing the same thing as, 5
Right.
other competitors.
Right.
Those are the situations where design thinking can really be useful, because again, it's looking beyond what's just stated in the interview and trying to understand the broader perspective, the wider perspective of why someone's saying that, and
Mhm.
looking at what the opportunities are, like where the gaps are, where the holes are, what can we fill in 6 to the market, where can we really make a difference here. And it's not it's not always looking at the failures of other products, but it's almost looking at some of the successes. Why have they gotten to where they've gotten, and what have they done well?
Mhm.
And we have a number of different ways of unpacking that and trying to figure out,
Mhm.
um, why has that brand been so successful? What is it about them? And how can we replicate that with our brand as well,
Right.
or better?
So do you find that there's either resistance or confusion about design thinking because it's not maybe an everyday concept that people are employing particularly within pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, no, honestly, no resistance, because it is so academically backed. Like the
Right.
Harvard Business School, you mentioned the MIT course, like all of them are putting forward courses, and most of the frameworks have data behind them, which is great because it is
Right.
scientifically founded, which is really interesting.
Sure.
Um, and I do think, like I said, people are looking to put the market research findings into the context of what this means. Like if you think about what a patient-doctor interaction looks like, patients with chronic conditions or even oncology patients, they're meeting with their doctor for 10, 15 minutes every couple months. And that is what we're basing a lot of our discussion on. And that's not the full picture. You need to think about everything else, that's all these other stakeholders that are involved, caregiver feedback, the things that patients are getting from influencers online, or the neighbor that had the same condition as them. What are all these other factors that are feeding into how they're feeling and what their experience is like? And on the same side, the physician, I mean, what is the physician hearing in those conversations in the hallway with their colleagues? What are they seeing at any lunch and learns or things like that? How are their rep interactions? Is that important to them? Is that where they're getting all their information? So there's so many other things that are feeding in outside of that 10-minute 15-minute interaction with the patient, that we need to understand to really know what's going on and where we can make an impact.
It's like reading a mystery novel, boy.
There's a lot happening, a lot to figure out. Yeah.
So a bit of a leading question, but what would you recommend companies do to figure out if or maybe not even if, but why and how they need to get involved?
Yeah,
with design thinking.
Yeah, no, great question. So, I mean, there's so much information out there already, just free. I mean, academics always love to share their theories. And so, just do a Google search and you'll read a lot about it. I think when people should think about it is if you have some of those bigger business questions that, just kind of a conversation with a doctor is not going to solve. Like you do get some insights through conversations, and you can read between the lines a bit, from traditional qualitative research or individual interviews, things like that. But when there's those bigger strategic questions that you have and other research hasn't been able to answer it, that's probably when you want to start thinking about design thinking and really trying to figure out what the bigger context is, where there's some other solution that maybe an interview is not going to answer for you. So I think that
when you hit the brick wall, right?
Well, hopefully before you get there. But yes, absolutely.
You're right.
That scenario.
Right. Well, Lisa, I want to thank you for enlightening me for one, but also sharing your thoughts and being here today. If anybody's interested in learning a little bit more about design thinking, please reach out to KMK Consulting. We'd be delighted to spend more time talking about design thinking and how it might apply to you. Lisa, thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me.